I think it's a great time to open and get questions from our audience. And we will have a microphone on the back of the room so you can say hi to Emily and she will come close to you.
One of our speakers talked about how a lot of the embryos that are created would not necessarily be viable if implanted. And if that's the case, what's the ethical issue there? If you know that it's not going to become a person, and it's not going to have the potential to be a person, what's the ethical consideration about using those stem cells?
So one of the tricks is that we still aren't very good at knowing which embryos are going to be able to become a baby and which are not. So they're trying really hard, for reasons unrelated to stem cell research, to get better at predicting that embryo is likely to keep going and that one isn't, because that's the holy grail for IVF treatment, right?
For parents too.
Right. Mm-hmm. So it's now, I think if we knew, and sometimes they do, because they have abnormal embryos that are patently abnormal, like they have, 3 pronuclei or something, so they can look at it and say that one is could never. It's not like we can't ever tell, it's that we generally aren't very good at it. So if it really is not going to, then those have been used in research. And they are
still
frequently.
Could not be federally funded, though. I mean,
no, you couldn't. Right?
That's the whole thing. Because even if you had what could be a viable embryo, it wouldn't for policy purposes. It still wouldn't matter.
They don't make
it would the lack of regulation about just clinical destruction of them would still be allowed. But destruction of them for the purpose of research using federal funds would still not be allowed.
It's kind of like why you should be really careful who you ask to write legislation, right? Because the legislation is like literally you can go home and Google this, you will see the words and they don't say things like unless they are non-viable human embryos and nowhere near that nuance. That's the kind of nuance you can get in through regulations or oversight by an authority, like a statutory authority or something like that, but it's not going to be in the legislation. The legislation is such a blunt tool that it doesn't make some sort of distinction between research on viable and non-viable embryos, even though people have totally made the argument you said, which is that those are really different things.
And I think the issue is, let's say a couple makes several like 8 embryos. The physician usually will look for the one, and you're only going to implant 1 or 2. You look for the healthiest, the ones that sort of look best, usually just looking under the microscope at which seem best formed.
And which are meeting by day 2 they should be this many cells, and so there's there are ways of grading embryos. It's not as if it's completely random. It's just that even with those grading systems, it's still the case that about 30% of the embryos that are transferred lead to a healthy birth, and the rest don't. So we still aren't really good at knowing the difference.
Just an additional aspect of that question. There are segments in the population who would answer you by saying viability has nothing whatsoever to do with this. That once conception occurs, once you have a zygote, once you have a sperm and an oocyte combined, that is a person. Mm-hmm. And therefore those embryos are entitled to be treated with the dignity with which you would treat a person. Yeah. And that argument has nothing whatsoever to do with viability, and that argument is out there. It's part of Roe v. Wade, and it's sort of the big question that's been dancing around for the last hour and a half that's still out there that will need to be addressed.
So while I think that you might find an over-representation of people that think that in positions of an elected office, that is not the position of the majority of people surveyed in public opinion polls. So there's a big disconnect, right? So the way that this issue is sort of presented in the public conversation in America is like you either think it's a person or you think it's nothing. Just like people say, well, you're either completely pro-life or completely pro-choice. Mm-hmm. And most people actually are somewhere in the middle, and that is not captured appropriately by policy, by regulation, even by public discussion. I think it's poorly discussed, it's poorly understood that
And I would-
most people are somewhere in the middle on all of these questions.
I would just say it's one of the reasons that informed consent is important. In other words, so that if the man and woman who create the embryos say, well, I understand there are people who say that, but I think I'd like to donate this for research, that gets around some of the obstacles.
And it's also the case that there are people who do IVF who do not want their embryos to go to research, and that we have to respect, I think. Like, that is not stupid, that is not ridiculous. I don't even think it's irrational. I think it's something that we need to respect
Personal
people's
choice.
beliefs, and they choose things like donating to another infertile person. They might think
Which
that
is-
that's
yes, which
a
is
really
certainly an
high, like a wonderful thing for them to do. Some people choose to just be given the embryo and to have it basically perish. So people do different things and have really different approaches, and it seems important, at least in a kind of clinical ethics perspective, to like respect that people have, especially people who've gone through IVF. Like, it's all very well to be like, this is how I would think about it if it was me, but if you actually do it, people have a variety of experiences, and some people surprise themselves by what they decide to do, right?
And I think that when we sort of just look at, we've created an embryo, how do we feel about the embryo is one thing, but when faced with the question of this embryo, this frozen embryo, these leftover clinically excess frozen embryos that the couple does not want for whatever reason, would we be happier letting it just be destroyed or be destroyed for the purposes of research? And so while we talk a lot about, and I think it is a valuable discussion, my master's thesis, involved large portions of, how do we classify the embryo? One of the bigger policy questions is we have the leftover embryos, and what should we be doing with them?
And some people do choose research for their leftover embryos, but that's a big category too. That's not just embryonic stem cell research. I mean, there's infertility treatment research that uses embryos to try to improve infertility treatment, and a lot of people who go through IVF might feel like that's the kind of research they want their embryos to help other people. So, even within that category of donating to research, embryonic stem cell research is one kind of research that you might donate to.
And the problem also is, as we talked earlier, a lot of couples are sort of ambivalent. So they've used so many embryos, they have so many left, and well, maybe we'll use them someday, or maybe whatever. And so rather than saying, no, I'm done now, just give them to research, often it's a complicated question, and it's obviously wrapped up with a lot of issues of meaning and emotion, and so people don't like to think it through all the time, understandably.
Yeah, that's right. I do think we need to be quite compassionate towards people who
I was just going to say, and even if they don't want to think it through, I mean, that's something that I think we can all respect. It's, but it's...
I can imagine being somebody who does not think that the embryo, who's like completely pro-choice, but still feels funny about what to do with the embryos. I think that's a perfectly understandable situation.
I would just say one other thing to me. I think embryos have some moral status, and I would argue, now I don't want to get in this whole debate, but that the issue is not just let's destroy embryos for the sake of destroying it. The issue is if we can come up with treatments that are going to save large numbers of people, it's
the debate.
Yeah.
right. It's weighing it. It's not just let's just destroy embryos for the sake of destroying it.
Do we know if there's a time limit of freezing the embryos? Like, is there a point where
We don't
then
know
it won't
yet.
be even useful for research at all?
We don't know.
We don't know.
We don't know. Which is just to say, no, not yet.
So you mentioned earlier the importance of knowing who is writing the legislation for these things. I'm a little surprised to hear that germline was included on a writer from Congress. Who wrote germline? I mean, I'm surprised to hear that they know those words.
Oh, I see.
So who is
Well,
writing
so they
that in?
didn't write germline. So they, I think, were actually more responding to the announcements in 2015 of CRISPR. So they were anticipating not so much mitochondrial replacement technology, which is a kind of intervention that results in a germline change as an heritable change. At least, yeah. They were more thinking about changing the genes of people generally. So the legislation is written in such a way that it talks about any I think I'm going to get the language a little wrong, but it's basically like any application for research that would introduce a heritable change into an embryo. So that captures mitochondrial replacement technology, but also,
Probably
they're not yet.
overcaptures
Well,
other
it's
things.
not, it's not. So that's what they knew about more than mitochondrial. They were thinking about gene editing, which was enormously in the news in 2015. So
they're never in conversation with anybody.
well, no, they did have hearings on in Congress, right, around
I
this.
don't know.
I mean, I do. So I follow this stuff, and I was like, they did what? Like, I felt a little kind of like taken by surprise. I can't tell you who sponsored. Well, it's not like a bill, so it didn't get sponsored. So I don't know who put that
put
in.
the
It came
writers
out
in.
of a committee. So I'm not sure who it was. And I haven't tried to figure that out. I don't actually know entirely how to figure that out in the US because it was in a subcommittee, I think, or a committee. So I don't know if it's even public record, like who, like.
I think it's known. But
It probably someone knows who did. Yeah. So, but it's not completely transparent. That's for sure. Yeah.
Just shifting gears a little bit, I'm curious about the ethics around the chimera issue. So this idea, not necessarily of embryonic stem cells, but just growing hearts in pigs, or that. Like, what are some of the ethical questions, or I don't know, any guidelines around that kind of work?
So,
Well, yeah.
so
a great
there
topic.
are, so that, as you say, there's tremendous potential in, quote, chimeras and their hybrids and different sort of mixing of cells from different species. So this is going on in animals. The question is whether to involve human cells and human embryonic cells. And so there are gradations of how much concern people have for various reasons. And certainly, for instance, we wouldn't want mice or chimps running around with human brain cells in them, right? That would be...
Oh, we definitely have mice with human brain cells. Absolutely.
Yes.
That
But maybe
definitely
they're not
happens.
running.
But not that are through reproductive tissue. In other
No.
words, right. So in other words, you wouldn't want mice reproducing that have, some would be able to sort of produce partly human brains. So in other words, one issue is it going to be affecting future generations of mice? And the other is, there is more of a concern about using primates because they're closer to us. And I think there's sort of a yuck feeling. So in ethics, there's sometimes the notion of some ethical issues get a sense of sort of moral disgust. And there was Leon Cass was the head of Bush's Bioethics Commission who said that should be the basis of ethical decision-making.
Some ethical decision.
Some ethical decision-making.
Just to be fair to them.
Okay, some of us disagree with that. And when you think historically, people have said, sex before marriage, yuck. Homosexuality, yuck. People of different races getting married, yuck. So the problem is that there are things we say yuck based on cultural issues in the past, and we now realize that was not a thought-through ethical response. So I would argue one needs to be careful. We have yuck responses to various things, but I would argue one needs to sort of think carefully, okay, well, maybe it's just because it's not familiar to me, rather than it's sort of being somehow wrong. So one needs to think these things through. I think so. Some chimera research raises these issues, but it really depends on what cells going where, from what species into what species, et cetera.
Yeah.
So the two, and I completely agree. And to build on that, there's sort of two predominant guidelines, two groups guidelines that have sort of dominated the conversations for the last number of years. One comes from the NIA and NIS, and one is ISSCR, which is the international ones. And the guidelines on chimeras, which actually New York State also followed, some of it, I think, I agree, is a yuck factor. Other parts of what we think are okay or not okay, when introducing human cells into animals, in part has to do with how much we are potentially humanizing the animal. Now, for whatever reason, maybe it's religious, maybe it's fear that certain animals that we think don't feel too much pain may feel more pain if they had more advanced cells in them. So there are many more restrictions on human introduction of human cells into primates and what parts of a primate. So, like the brain, spinal, neural. And one of the other general prohibitions has to do with whether or not you have two chimera animals that have human chimera cells that could potentially be mated to each other, so that if there was any potential that the human cells in the animal formed gametes and that you mated them, you know, who knows what kind of that could create. So that's actually another one of the chimera principles. But if you're interested, I would encourage you to look at the ISSCR guidelines, or even NISTEM, or the Ethics Committee of New York State had long discussions on this as well.
It's really, in my view, a under-theorized and poorly guidelined area of scientific research, and it hasn't become a big problem yet because the efficiency of the transplant of human cells into even embryonic mice, the efficiency has been really low. So we haven't really had to deal with it in a big way, but I feel like it is one of the biggest areas, underexplored, under-theorized, under-examined, under-guidelined area. So I sit on a stem cell committee, and we get these chimera questions, and we find ourselves with almost nothing to help us figure out what even matters in this scenario. We ask questions like, do you think any of these human cells will go to the brain of the animal? And they say no, and we're like, oh well, that's fine probably then. Like, why? I don't really know. Or they say yes, and we're like, oh, how much percentage are you thinking the brain would become human neurons? And they're like 10%. We're like, oh, that's probably fine. Like, why? I don't know. And then they say that based on previous studies, because actually it's been really hard to get, but you know, some studies are like trying to get lots of human neuron cells in the brain of the mouse. That's the whole point of the study. And then we're like, well, would that be okay? I don't know. Well, it depends. Like,
And what is the why? Why might that be okay or not okay?
What are we worried about? I think there are things, I have my own views about it, but I feel like as a general thing, the conversation, the sort of academic discussion of it, the professional discussion, the guidelines around it are all just paper thin.
Yeah.
It's really an undeveloped thing.
There's statements, but we can all try to figure out why they're there. They might be defensible, but when you're actually faced with, here's the protocol, why are we worried that there may be more brain cells?
And what are we worried about? And what are we
worried about the
protect?
pain?
And what
Are
would
we
look
worried about the
bad?
humanization? Like, what is the why behind it? And maybe there's many whys.
Yeah.
But
no,
the fact is
it's
the conversation
I think
hasn't
it's
happened.
a rich area that has not yet received enough attention.
And probably part of another issue with it is that there's been the NIH about a year and a half ago decided to lift a ban on funding research in this area. They got 22,000 comments in response, which is a huge amount of comments for federal proposed legislation, and it's just nothing's happened. So I think there's been, I think Congress still bans sort of introduction of human cells into animals, for reproductive or into the brain, or there's certain guidelines on it, and NIH suggested lifting that, and it's not been lifted.
Much work to be done in that area.
So so as y'all talked about, a lot of where the legality issues come into play are with funding. So federal funding for things being dictated by, and you mentioned that a lot of times states will then take it upon themselves, but private enterprise also will, I assume, begin, as we see more and more, especially as the technology gets better, take it upon themselves. So with stem cell research, with chimera, even with CRISPR and germline modifications, other than funding, what is the legality, and where would that legality sort of come from to say you know, in your office building can't take embryos, make a CRISPR modification, and then let that into the evolutionary gene pool?
Well, so the FDA would have a lot of oversight once you're actually planning to do something with a person, right? With you're actually going to put something in a human, whether it's cells or embryo. You know, once you start getting into, so right now all this is all basic research, not doing trials in humans. Once you want to do a trial in human, you need to go through the FDA, and then the FDA would have some oversight, right? Now the FDA doesn't have a whole lot of rules about some of the things we've been talking about, but even private industry would have to go through the FDA if they were developing something that they were going to offer as a treatment.
And that's actually the hook. The FDA jurisdiction is, and I study it, and I couldn't explain it.
Yeah, it's
and
pretty.
It's changing
it is
now.
Yes, exactly.
If
And
legal
right.
geeks can spend a long time looking at
And
that.
it's
FDA
actually very hard
rules.
where the FDA, the only place it might come in is the FDA, and the FDA generally will look at things that are being developed for the purposes of ultimate approval for market. It will not generally look at things that are the practice of medicine, which was what
Right,
we were
so that's
talking
the-
about
that's the
before,
blurry
even when things are not, they're sort of novel. But
So if it's like a new surgical technique, it doesn't go through the FDA, but if it's a device or a drug, it does. So what would stem cell
Extremely
products
complex,
be? And that
Yep.
the FDA has asserted authority, right, over
Some.
the stem cell. Yeah.
It's actually had part of the reason why we have this proliferation, which we didn't really discuss today, of these for-profit stem cell clinics that advertise. We were talking about, you put some stem cells on your face and your wrinkles will go away, and if you take out your fat and you do this. Part of the problem is that there's actually no agency that can actually regulate it, given their current jurisdiction. And so there are sort of a lot of problems as to sort of some of the more unethical practices going on in stem cell therapy, stem cell clinics. Now, if it crosses state lines, then you've got a hook. I mean, it ends up being some of the really dorky stuff, but some of this is very complex because there is, even if there's sort of a public concern about it, and certainly with the for-profit stem cell clinics, there's a huge concern, but part of the problem is how do we stop it given the way the government works and where the jurisdiction is?
Because if you were, say, doing mitochondrial replacement, no one is really empowered to come knock on your door and say, you're now going to jail for that, if you sort of got around all the fun, is that
So
assessment?
But the problem is,
that taking an embryo and changing it and putting it back in someone's body is the FDA has asserted authority over that. Now they can't look at it because of this law.
as soon as you deal with a human being, it gets looked at. I think, on the other hand, though, just in terms of research in labs, which I think you were asking a little bit about, we have intellectual freedom here. So as a researcher in a university, there are many things. The law doesn't say you can't study certain areas by and large. That's about why funding is sort of separated off as one of the levers than the FDA in terms of uses. I would say the other area, the reason the FDA is changing on this is because there is becoming a whole area of potential treatments that are biologics, right, where we're now going to be giving gene therapy. It's no longer a medication, a chemical compound, but there are other kinds of things we can give that may help treat a disease that are more just biological things. And there are a lot of questions about what should the approval process be for those? Should it be different? Should it be individualized? And that's the 21st Century Cures Act addresses some issues with biologics, but this is a rapidly changing area because, again, the technology is advancing, and we're trying to figure out how we should regulate these
And
things.
even though it might be good for those small clinics that there isn't really clarity about some of the regulation, it's not good for the larger players in the industry. Like as a general rule, not knowing what exactly the regulatory picture is really bad for companies, for industry, because any uncertainty like that is very, basically makes people not want to do that work or not want to pursue that because they don't know exactly how it's going to come out in terms of
Or
regulation.
those who could figure out that there is no
Yeah.
regulation, then very much take advantage of the fact that there is no regulation.
So,
And how much can they profit? How much can they?
The big players in the pharmaceutical industry and the biomedical treatment industry are probably wanting there to be a kind of oversight, not just any oversight, but whereas some of these small clinics are exploiting a kind of a gap.
Exactly.
My question is a follow-up on the yuck factor and the informed consent issue. I was wondering if there's been any efforts made to obtain retroactive informed consent on embryos in research
You mean from the people who...
from the parents and donors
So
specifically?
the problem, as I understand it, is that a lot of clinics have
hard.
thousands of leftover embryos, and they contact the people. They'll send a letter. As you know, this costs us, $500 a year to store. Do you want us to continue to store it? If so, send us a check or let us know if you no longer want us to store it. And they get no answer. So it's hard. A lot of people, because either people are ambivalent, this is your future potential kids, and well, maybe someday we'll use them. And so there's a lot of feelings. And so a lot of the I'll say the parents, that just don't respond at all. So I think that's part of the problem. But it's a good question. I don't know in terms if there have been efforts to get retrospective.
I mean,
consent.
Well, that is though, I mean, to reach out again, if either in the process of, do you want to continue to pay the fees for freezing? If not, what would you like us to do? Now, how much response is received is
right.
different, but I think there is a fair amount of attempts to contact.
They don't get a
Again,
lot of
how
response.
successful,
Yeah.
I don't know.
And there are sort of two times when you might ask people, what do you want us to do with your embryos in the event of different things happening? One of those times is before the embryos are created. And so clinics have now gotten to the point, like they didn't have this down pat initially, but where they'll actually run people through scenarios in a consent form. If you die, what do you want to, should it go to my partner? Should it go, so you sign off on a bunch of stuff in advance. And theoretically, you don't get to, it probably even says in there, like, if we don't pay your fee, we'll do whatever we want with your embryos type of thing. But they just actually don't like to do it because they're freaked out that it will come to the media and it'll be bad press and other stuff. So, like, it's not that they couldn't do whatever they want, maybe, because they might be able to treat them as a band. It's just that people don't actually do that. They don't want to do that, in fact, the clinics. So,
Although for a lot of the stem cell research, you do need to give specific consent.
well, so then that's the second thing about it, right? So usually, even if you've set up front, like this is what we want to happen in different scenarios, before you would actually donate those embryos to that researcher, you would get consent from the person. That's a general rule from regular research. It's not just some special rule for embryonic stem cell research. And so you need those people to sign off on it, on the particular thing that you're going to actually propose to do right then. And that does not seem inappropriate to me, that you would actually require consent from the people whose materials you were going to use in research. There is a version of your question, which maybe isn't what you meant, but where like, there was a time when it was like, there were these embryos that people wanted to donate to research, and they maybe had used a sperm donor, and the sperm donor had said, you can use my sperm to make an embryo, but they hadn't said, and if the embryo is left over, you can use it for research. And some guidelines were like, you need the permission of everybody whose genetic material is involved, not just. So theoretically, you would be like, we go back and get this. No, they don't. It's impractical to go back and get consent from those gamete donors. It's not that you would go back and get consent from the embryo donors. You would get consent from them at the time of donation.
Yep.
And that's where some of these issues come up. Like if you can't get in contact with them, then you can't get their consent.
And then what do you do?
Well, the clinic has a dilemma about what to do, but you can't do research. Yeah. Like that is just clear.
And what's actually interesting about at least the Obama era regulations, one of the biggest critiques was that you did not have to get consent if it was basically an anonymous gamete donor. You had to only get consent from basically those who were in custody of the leftover embryo, which meant basically if they gave consent, the privacy rights, the rights to, what you do with your materials of the person who donated the gamete actually very much could have been arguably violated, and that is still the policy.
Oh, yeah.
The other problem is 2/3 of IVF clinics are private. They're not affiliated with hospitals or universities, so they're not even thinking about research.
They might not even be offering embryonic stem cell research to their people because they don't have researchers that they're connected with, and it's not part of what they offer. And so you might be all like, I want to donate my embryos to embryonic stem cell research, and they're like, we don't have that link, we don't have that option. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we have this, that, or the next thing you can do.
Well,
Okay.
I think we
And
could
on
probably
that
go
profound
on
note.
and talk about many other topics too, but I think that we have to wrap it up. I just want to thank you guys so much for
you're welcome.
joining us in this
And-
wonderful, important conversation.